Welcome back to Unknown Military History. I know it has been many months since I last uploaded. Life and its consequences have kept me very busy. With that being said, I've been thinking for a while that I had unfinished business regarding this podcast, so now here I am, returned from the clamor of the modern world to take you back in time once more. I apologize for my absence, and I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to share the glories of history with you again. Without further ado, let us begin. Where we last left off, Poland, under the leadership of Marshal Joseph Pilsudski, had won major successes against the initial onslaught of the Soviet Red Army during the Kiev Offensive alongside their Ukrainian allies. This success was in part due to deorganized Soviet front lines in the west, as they were still fighting the remnants of the White forces in the Russian Civil War. However, with the triumph of the Red Army against the Whites in Siberia under Alexander Kolchak, in the Volunteer Army in the Crimea, Lenin and his Bolsheviks were able to direct their battle-hardened forces west to deal with the Poles. As stated in previous episodes, Poland was seen by many Soviet leaders as merely a stepping stone to spreading communism west into nations like Germany, which had been broken by unrest after their defeat in World War I. In any case, the Red Army had launched a successful counteroffensive under the head of the Red Army, Leon Trotsky, and his skilled generals such as Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Alexander Yegorov, who had commanded the northern and southern fronts in the Western Offensive. The Poles had been defeated, forcing them to hastily retreat back west. The gains that the Polish army had made during the Kiev Offensive had been overturned almost as quickly as it had appeared, and the Poles were now in an even worse position than they were at the start of the conflict. The survival of Poland itself was at stake, and many Western observers expected their forces to collapse under the onslaught of the mass Russian offensive. The Soviets, who now had the offensive, decided on the strategy of a mass assault towards the Polish capital, Warsaw. Capturing this vital city would mark the fall of Poland, as morale would shatter and uprisings would cause further instability. Thus, in early June, the renowned Russian 1st Cavalry Army, under the command of Semyon Budyonny, broke through Polish lines which had been in an ordered retreat. Budyonny's success caused many other Polish fronts to subsequently collapse. On the 4th of July, Mikhail Tukhachevsky's forces began an all-out attack on the Berezina River in Belarus, forcing the Polish forces there to retreat, and on the 22nd, Brest fortress was captured. Luckily for the Poles, by the August of 1920, their retreat had become more structured and supply lines were improved and put in place. Marshal Joseph Pilsudski aimed to halt the Soviet advance at the Bug River and Brest-Litovsk. However, Soviet forces there broke through and a new plan was needed. On August 5th and 6th, Pilsudski met with his top generals in Belvedere Palace in Warsaw, Poland, to formalize a new strategy which would allow Polish forces to withdraw across the Vistula River in order to defend key positions near Warsaw and the neighboring Weipers River. In the south, divisions would be concentrated for a counteroffensive. General Joseph Haller would command the central front with the goal of maintaining a passive stance and defending Warsaw at all costs. General Władysław Sikorski's 5th Army would defend Modlin Fortress and strike the Soviet forces from behind Warsaw. General Franciszek Latnik's 1st Army would aid Haller in defending Warsaw. General Bolesław Roja's 2nd Army would have the offensive of holding the Vistula River line. In the meantime, a 20,000-strong force under Pilsudski himself would wait in the southern front and spearhead an offensive from the Vistula Weipers River by targeting a weak spot in the Soviet lines in the south and encircle the Soviets near the East Prussian border. The plan was very risky. It was seen as a gamble due to its logistical challenge, and even Pilsudski himself thought that this plan was boom or bust. High-ranking officers in the French military mission doubted the Polish army's ability to regroup cohesively after their retreat. However, with the clock ticking and the looming Soviet advance, this plan was the only hope. The Poles needed a miracle. On the other hand, the Soviets were divided. Tukhachevsky planned to encircle Warsaw from the northwest. However, his southern flank was weak, This was in part due to the fact that the front had expanded since the Soviet advance, and there were various logistical and communications challenges that would come up. What happened next is a subject of controversy. Tukhachevsky ordered the Southwestern Front under the command of Semyon Budyonny and Joseph Stalin to reinforce his advance west. However, due to either disobedience, miscommunication, or orders from Trotsky or Lenin, Budyonny and Stalin instead reinforced the Crimean Front at the expense of the Polish Front. In the first stages of the battle for Warsaw, the Red Army under Tukhachevsky launched a major offensive on August 12th. Gaik Bishnikan's cavalry corps and the 4th Army crossed the Wurka River, advancing toward Wolkalik, while the 15th and 3rd Armies neared Modlin Fortress, and the 16th Army headed towards Warsaw. The Soviet 16th Army quickly captured Razmydin, just 23 kilometers from Warsaw, prompting Pilsudski to accelerate his counteroffensive plans. By August 14th, Razmydin was lost to the Red Army, and the Polish 5th Army faced intense pressure from 3 Soviet armies. Despite heavy fighting, the 5th Army held its ground, with critical support from elite units and a daring raid by the 203rd Ulan Regiment that disrupted Soviet communications. Pilsudski personally supervised the Polish counterattack, raising troop morale and overcoming logistical challenges, including a shortage of equipment and supplies. His efforts paid off as the Polish forces mounted a successful defense and counterattack, marking a turning point in the battle for Warsaw. The 27th Infantry Division of the Red Army, meanwhile, reached the village of Izabelin, just 13 kilometers from Warsaw, but this would be their closest advance to the capital. Tukhachevsky believed that his plan was unfolding perfectly, but, in truth, he was falling into Pilsudski's trap. The main Russian advance met not only token resistance as they moved north and towards the Vistula. Meanwhile, the Soviet left flank south of Warsaw was defended by the small Mosier group and was left vulnerable, therefore. Budyonny, leading the 1st Cavalry Army, disobeyed orders to advance on Warsaw, influenced by personal grudges and political maneuverings. Many scholars believe that Budyonny had a personal rivalry with Tukhachevsky, and Yegorov, the other commander in this unit allied with Tukhachevsky. Stalin, for reasons unknown, aimed to capture Lviv instead. Consequently, Budyonny marched on Lviv, alongside Stalin, missing the crucial battle. Tukhachevsky was now alone without his reinforcements that he needed to advance to work. On August 14th, the Polish 5th Army counterattacked, crossing the Wukra River and engaging the Soviet 3rd and 15th Armies. The intense battle at Nysilisk lasted until August 15th, resulting in the town's near destruction. However, the Soviet advance was halted, and Polish forces would recapture Razmydin, boosting morale. Sikorsky's 5th Army, supported by tanks, armored cars, and armored trains supplied from the west, pushed the exhausted Soviet units away from Warsaw in a blitzkrieg manner, advancing 30 kilometers a day and disrupting the Soviet northern maneuvers. On August 16th, the Polish assault group, led by Pilsudski, began its northward march from the Wieprz River. They faced the Mazur Group, a Soviet corps that had previously defeated the Poles during the Kiev operation just a few months earlier. However, in their pursuit of the retreating Polish forces, the Mazur Group had been severely depleted, reduced to just 1 or 2 divisions that were spread thinly over a 150-kilometer front on the left flank of the Soviet 16th Army. Therefore, on that first day of the counteroffensive, only 1 of the 5 Polish divisions encountered any of the resistance. The remaining 4, supported by a cavalry brigade, advanced 45 kilometers north without opposition. By evening, they had liberated the town of Woldala and cut off the communication and supply lines of the Soviet 16th Army. Pilsudski himself was taken aback by these early successes. The assault group had covered around 70 kilometers in only 36 hours. As planned, they split the Soviet fronts, disrupting their offensive without significant resistance. The Mazur Group was defeated on the day of the Polish counterattack, creating a large gap between the Soviet fronts. The Polish armies exploited this opening ruthlessly, pressing their northward offensive with 2 armies catching the enemy by surprise. On August 18th, Tukhachevsky, stationed at his headquarters in Minsk, 300 miles east of Warsaw, realized the full extent of his defeat. He quickly ordered the Red Army to retreat and regroup, aiming to straighten the front line, improve logistics, regain the initiative, and push back the Poles. However, the situation had already spiraled beyond his control. His orders either arrived too late or did not reach the troops at all. Soviet General Bishchikan's 3rd Cavalry Corps continued to advance towards Pomerania, despite its lines being threatened by the Polish 5th Army, which had been pursuing the retreating Red Army. The Polish 1st Legion's Infantry Division undertook a forced march to cut off the enemy's retreat, covering 163 miles from Libertown to Białystok in just 6 days, moving up to 21 hours a day. During this period, the division engaged the enemy twice, intercepting the 16th Soviet Army near Mishailok and forcing most of its troops to surrender. The Soviet armies in the center of the front fell into chaos. Some divisions continued to push towards Warsaw, while others retreated in disarray, losing cohesion and succumbing to panic. Tukhachevsky lost contact with most of his forces, throwing Soviet plans into disorder. Only the 15th Army remained organized, trying to follow Tukhachevsky's orders and shield the withdrawal of the westernmost 4th Army. However, it was defeated on August 19th and 20th, joining the general route of the Red Army's northwestern front. Tukhachevsky was left with no choice but to order a full retreat towards the western Bug River. By August 21st, all organized resistance had collapsed, and by August 31st, the Soviet southwestern front was completely routed. Poland's victory at the Battle of Warsaw in 1920 would go down as the Miracle on the Vistula. The Soviets had lost 15,000 dead, 500 missing, 10,000 wounded, and 65,000 captured. In the aftermath of the battles, the Poles would isolate and defeat Semyon Budyonny's 1st Cavalry Army, which was besieging Lviv alongside Stalin. While Tukhachevsky managed to reorganize his lines in the retreat, he could not regain the initiative, and the Poles would defeat the reorganized Red Army again at the Battle of the Niemen River. The Soviets would lose over 40,000 men in this battle. Eventually, pressure from Western powers such as France and Britain would force both sides to sign a ceasefire, and thus, on March 18, 1921, the Treaty of Riga was signed. Under the treaty, Poland would recognize Soviet control of Ukraine and Belarus, while Russia would recognize Galicia and other territories of the old Tsarist Empire, which was inhabited largely by Poles, as part of the new Polish state. While Poland had managed to regain its independence, Pilsudski's dream of an intermarium alliance with an independent Belarus and Ukraine would not be realized, as he had to recognize Soviet control over these regions. For the Soviets, the loss of this war would be viewed as one of Lenin's greatest failures. The goal of this war had been a quick, decisive victory to create a staging ground for supporting the communists in the West, particularly in the Spartacist revolution in Germany. The political situation in the Soviet high command would also fracture during this time. Tukhachevsky blamed the disaster on the Vistula, on Stalin and Budyonny for not obeying his orders, creating a hatred between them. Many years later, when Stalin became the dictator of the Soviet Union, Tukhachevsky and his military clique would be purged, suspected of being sympathizers of the exiled Trotsky, who also fell out of favor with Lenin after the war due to political infighting. Many historians consider the Polish-Soviet War and the Battle of Warsaw as one of the most decisive moments of the modern era. A Soviet victory in this war might have meant that communism would have spread much more rapidly throughout Western Europe and, in a larger extent, the world. Instead, Poland had risen from the ashes to cement its independence. Today, this battle is a strong reminder to Poles of their resilience and prowess in fighting for their freedom. Thank you for listening in today on Unknown Military History. It's glad to be back. Until next time, this is your host, Anthony Tran, signing off.